That night, Scarlett Hayes, 7 years old, second grade, was expelled from school in a single email. No explanation. No meeting. No chance to say a word. The next morning, the school board walked into their conference room like any other Tuesday. What they didn't know was that her father, Sebastian Reed, single dad, systems engineer, was already sitting in the corner. No anger, no raised voice, just a USB drive on the table. And one sentence: "You just made the biggest mistake of your careers." 15 minutes later, the entire board sat in complete silence. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who thought they were untouchable, you won't be able to stop listening. The email had arrived at 10:47 at night. No phone call, no warning, no meeting scheduled for the following morning, just a single message sitting in an inbox, cold and precise, its subject line reading like a verdict that had already been delivered without a trial. Scarlett Hayes, a girl who still carried a small stuffed rabbit in her backpack every day, had been expelled from Maplewood Elementary, effective immediately. One sentence, one line of bureaucratic finality. And somewhere in that house on Birchwood Lane, a father who rarely raised his voice sat completely still and read it 3 times. Sebastian Reed did not call the school that night. He did not slam his laptop shut or pace the kitchen floor in fury. He did not reach for his phone to call a lawyer or a friend or anyone at all. He just looked at the screen, and something very quiet, very cold, and very deliberate began to move behind his eyes. Sebastian Reed was 38 years old. He lived in a modest 2-bedroom house in the kind of neighborhood where people left their garage doors open on Saturday mornings and kids rode bikes on the sidewalk until dinner. He drove a 6-year-old sedan, cooked the same 4 meals on rotation, and spent most of his evenings sitting at a second-hand desk with 3 monitors arranged in a careful arc, doing contract work in systems engineering. From the outside, there was nothing remarkable about him. That was, in many ways, exactly how he preferred it. Scarlett was the one thing in his life that he had never once tried to make unremarkable. She was curious and quiet and deeply serious about the things that mattered to her: books about animals, puzzles with too many pieces, the way certain words sounded when you said them slowly. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stillness, and she had been at Maplewood for 2 years without a single incident recorded in her file. She was also, as 7-year-olds in second grade sometimes are, lonely. Not the dramatic, theatrical kind of lonely. She didn't cry at recess, or beg her father to let her stay home. She simply hadn't found her people yet. There was a particular cluster of girls in her class who moved through the hallways like they had already decided who belonged and who didn't, and Scarlett, without ever quite understanding why, had been sorted into the second category. She adapted to it the way she adapted to most things: quietly, carefully, and without complaint. Sebastian had noticed. He always noticed. But he had never worried, because worry without information is just noise, and Sebastian Reed had always preferred signal. He walked to Scarlett's room that night and stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her sleep. The rabbit was tucked under her arm. The nightlight threw soft shapes across the ceiling. He thought about waking her and decided against it. She would find out in the morning. Tonight, she could still believe the world was simple. He went back to his desk. The email was still open on his screen. He read it again, not for the content this time, but for the structure, the phrasing, the timestamp, the sender address, and the 4 words at the very bottom, printed in a smaller font size than everything above them, almost as if they were an afterthought, or perhaps a mistake left in by someone who hadn't thought carefully enough about what they were sending. Board decision confidential. Sebastian leaned forward in his chair. He opened a second window. Scarlett woke up at 7:15 the next morning and padded into the kitchen to find her father already sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and a stack of papers he turned face down when she appeared. He made her toast with the strawberry jam she liked. He told her, in a calm and level voice, that she wouldn't be going to school that day. When she asked why, he said there had been a mix-up that he was going to go sort out. When her face crumpled slightly around the edges, not quite crying, but close, she asked the question that would stay with Sebastian for a very long time afterward. "Did I do something wrong, Dad?" He looked at her across the kitchen table. He thought carefully, the way he always did, before he spoke. "No," he said. "You didn't do anything wrong. Someone else did." It wasn't until she was in the other room, watching the morning cartoons she was usually too rushed to see, that the quiet sound reached him: a small, muffled kind of crying, the kind a 7-year-old tries very hard to hide. He stood in the kitchen doorway and listened to it, and he did not move for a long time. Then he went back to his desk. Sebastian had been a careful reader his entire life, and the email that had arrived the previous night rewarded careful reading in ways that its author had clearly not intended. The first thing he noticed, the thing that had made him lean forward the previous night, was the sender address. It carried the Maplewood Elementary domain, but it had not been routed through the district's official communication platform. That platform, which Sebastian happened to know quite well, generated a specific header signature on every outbound message. This email did not have it. Someone had composed it directly from a server-side account, bypassing the standard system entirely. The second thing he noticed was the timestamp. The email claimed to have been sent at 10:47 in the evening. But the metadata embedded in the message header told a different story. The gap between the message's creation time and its transmission time was 11 minutes long enough for someone to draft it, review it, and make a decision about whether to send it. More interestingly, the creation timestamp fell during school hours, which meant this had been written during the day and held before being released. Someone had planned this. And then they had waited until most people would be in bed. He made a third cup of coffee and sat back in his chair and thought about what Scarlett had told him over breakfast haltingly, between bites of toast, in the disjointed way that children tell stories when the story still confuses them. A girl in her class named Madison had told the teacher that Scarlett had copied her answers during the Thursday morning math quiz. Scarlett had said no, she hadn't. That wasn't what happened, but the teacher, a woman named Mrs. Patricia Vance, had simply said the matter was being reviewed by the administration. That was 3 days ago. There had been no further communication from the school. No meeting scheduled, no written notice of any disciplinary process, and then the email, in the middle of the night. Sebastian pulled up the district's public directory and spent 4 minutes locating Madison's last name, Cole. Madison Cole. He cross-referenced it against the school board's published roster and sat very still for a moment. Charlotte Cole. Board member. 2-term incumbent. Chair of the Student Affairs Committee. He wrote the name down on a piece of paper, then folded the paper and set it to the side. He thought about the classroom camera that Scarlett had mentioned, the one mounted in the corner above the whiteboard, the one that Mrs. Vance had apparently told another student had been malfunctioning the week of the quiz. He thought about the way Mrs. Vance had changed the subject when Scarlett had tried to explain what had actually happened in class. He thought about the quiet, systematic way in which every possible avenue for appeal had been removed before the final blow was delivered. This was not a miscommunication. This was not an administrative error. Every piece of it had been assembled deliberately by someone who understood exactly which levers to pull. Sebastian Reed opened his laptop and began to work. He did not call the school. He did not call the district office. He did not draft an angry email to the principal or post anything anywhere or ask anyone for help. People who had watched him in the days following the expulsion might have found it strange, the wronged father who simply sat at his computer and said nothing, did nothing visible, made no noise. His neighbor, an older man named Gerald, who sometimes brought over zucchini from his garden, knocked on the door the following afternoon and asked if everything was all right. Sebastian thanked him, said yes, took the zucchini, and closed the door. What nobody watching from the outside could have known was that Sebastian Reed had spent 6 years before his current career as a freelance systems engineer, working in data security for the State Department of Education. He had not left that work voluntarily. There had been a situation, a vendor contract with irregularities that he had flagged, a supervisor who had not appreciated the flagging, and a departure that was framed as a resignation but had felt, at the time, like something closer to being shown a door. He had spent the years since building a quieter kind of life. He had told himself, more than once, that he was glad to be out of it. He had kept, however, every access credential, every audit methodology, and every trace of the institutional knowledge he had accumulated. Not out of spite, simply because he was the kind of person who did not throw things away when they might still be useful. People don't break the rules, he had told a colleague once, years ago, during a long debrief after a particularly ugly audit. They just assume no one is skilled enough to find out. The colleague had laughed. Sebastian had not been joking. He pulled up the state's education data infrastructure. the back-end logging system that recorded every action taken on district-managed devices and servers, and he began, with the methodical patience of someone who had done this hundreds of times before, to read. The log files were extensive. Sebastian had always liked log files. They were honest in a way that people rarely were. They recorded every action in sequence, without opinion or justification, and they could not be coached or pressured into changing their story. You could delete a file, but the deletion itself was logged. You could edit a document, but the edit left a trace. The system remembered everything, even the things people wanted it to forget. It took him 4 hours to find the first anomaly. The expulsion email had not been generated through any official workflow, no discipline form had been filed, no parent notification protocol had been initiated, no administrative review had been documented. The email existed in isolation. A single action taken on a district server account that was registered to the office of the Student Affairs Committee, Charlotte Cole's office. He noted this and kept reading. The academic misconduct report, the formal document that had supposedly initiated the entire process against Scarlett, had a modification timestamp that was 3 days more recent than its creation date. Someone had opened the original document, changed something, and saved it. The original version was gone from the primary system. But log files are not the primary system. They sit deeper, quieter, in a layer that most administrators do not think about and most users never see. Sebastian found the original version in a backup cache that had not been touched in 72 hours. He extracted it, compared it to the current version, and sat back in his chair. The original document, filed by Mrs. Vance on the day of the quiz, contained a single sentence in the notes field. Inconclusive, observed behavior ambiguous. No direct evidence of misconduct. The current version said, "Student confirmed to have viewed another student's paper during assessment." The sentence had been rewritten completely. The name of the person who had made the change was not recorded in the document itself, but the server log, reliable, impassive, incapable of lying, showed the account that had accessed the file. Charlotte Cole's office account. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment. Then he kept going. He spent the next 2 hours in the district's archived records, pulling up historical discipline files with the same access methods. What he found there stopped him more completely than anything else had. In the previous 2 academic years, 3 other students at Maplewood Elementary had been removed not through formal expulsion proceedings, but through a series of administrative actions that amounted to the same thing. Attendance records flagged, behavior reports generated, parents quietly informed that alternative placement might be in everyone's best interest. 3 families who had, in each case, simply taken their children elsewhere, rather than fight a system that seemed determined to push them out. He looked at the records carefully. Each of the 3 students had, at some point in the months before their removal, been involved in a conflict with a child whose parent sat on the school board. None of the 3 families had known what he now knew. Sebastian pulled his external hard drive from the desk drawer. He began to save files, the cache footage from the backup camera, the secondary unit in the classroom that served as a redundancy and that the administration had apparently forgotten existed, the server logs with their unambiguous timestamps, the original version of the misconduct report, and the edited version, laid side by side. The archived records of the 3 previous students, and, near the end of his session, something he had almost missed, a chain of internal messages between Charlotte Cole's office account and the school principal's administrative address, sent the morning of the expulsion, the last of which contained 4 words that were, in their own way, the most damning thing he had found. Handle it quietly. Done. He copied everything to the drive. He verified the copies. He closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the sound of the television in the other room, where Scarlett had fallen asleep on the couch with the rabbit on her chest. The camera backup footage took time to process, but when it finally rendered cleanly on his screen, Sebastian watched it twice. The classroom was at its typical mid-morning level of organized chaos. 22 second graders bent over their desks, pencils moving. Mrs. Vance walking the aisles with the slow and slightly distracted rhythm of a teacher trying to watch 22 things at once. Scarlett was in the 4th row. Madison Cole sat 1 row over and 2 seats forward. At the 11-minute mark of the recording, Madison turned her head. She looked clearly, unmistakably, for a count of roughly 4 seconds at the paper on Scarlett's desk. Then she turned back to her own work. Then, 40 seconds later, When Mrs. Vance had moved to the far side of the room, Madison reached into her folder, withdrew something, and made an exchange that required only a moment. She raised her hand shortly afterward. Sebastian watched it again. Then he closed the file. He had wondered, briefly, about the teacher. Mrs. Patricia Vance had been with Maplewood for 11 years. Her personnel file showed consistent evaluations, nothing remarkable. A woman who had found her equilibrium and stayed there. She had not initiated the misconduct report in the spirit it was later framed. She had written inconclusive. Someone had overwritten her assessment without her consent, and when the pressure came, and Sebastian suspected the pressure had come in some form he couldn't fully document, she had simply stopped talking. He did not blame her. He understood the arithmetic of that kind of silence. When the person doing the pressuring controlled your annual review, controlled the committee that recommended contract renewals, controlled the quiet mechanisms of institutional power that most people preferred not to examine too closely, the cost of speaking was very high. And nobody had offered Mrs. Vance a reason to believe that speaking would actually change anything. Scarlett, for her part, had told him something the second morning that he hadn't expected. She was eating cereal and looking at the table, and she said, without looking up, that she didn't hate Madison. He asked her if she was sure. She thought about it for a moment with the seriousness she brought to most things and said she guessed so. She just didn't understand why Madison didn't like her. Sebastian looked at his daughter across the breakfast table and thought that she was, in some essential way, a fundamentally better person than most of the adults who had spent the last week trying to reshape the world around her convenience. He said, "Some people are afraid of people they don't understand." Scarlett considered this and went back to her cereal. That night, after she was asleep, Sebastian sat at his desk for 4 hours and built something that was not a complaint, not a petition, and not a legal brief. It was a presentation, 19 slides, structured the way he had once structured audit reports, chronological, evidence first, with every claim supported by a source and every source traceable to a verifiable record. He printed 2 copies of the complete file, bound them with binder clips, and labeled each one with a date and a case number he invented for the purpose of making them look exactly as official as they were. He put the printed copies in a manila folder. He copied everything to a USB drive and labeled it with a single strip of white tape. He did not email anything to anyone. He did not contact a lawyer. He did not call the local news station or speak to any of the other parents whose children had been removed, though he had considered both. He had decided, sometime around midnight, that the most effective thing he could do was also the simplest. He would walk into the room where the decisions had been made, and he would show the people who had made them exactly what they had done, in a setting where there was no ambiguity, and no plausible deniability, and no option to delay. He would give them the experience of being seen. When he turned off his desk lamp and went to check on Scarlett one last time before bed, he stood in her doorway for a moment and said, quietly enough that she couldn't hear him, "Tomorrow, they'll have to listen." Then he went to bed. He slept well, which surprised him slightly, but he had always slept well when the work was finished and the evidence was complete. The Maplewood School District Board of Trustees held its regular monthly meeting on the second Tuesday of every month, beginning at 8:30 in the morning in Conference Room B of the District Administration Building, a beige, low-ceilinged room with a long oval table, a projector screen mounted to the wall, and a small section of chairs along the side for members of the public who occasionally attended. The meetings rarely drew observers. Sebastian had been to 2 of them in the past, years ago, for reasons that had nothing to do with Scarlett. He arrived at 8:22 that morning. He signed in with the administrative assistant at the front desk, who did not ask him his purpose and did not appear to notice anything unusual about his presence. He carried the manila folder and the USB drive and a cup of coffee he had made at home and brought in a travel mug because he had always thought that buying coffee from a drive-thru on the way to something important was a waste of 7 minutes he might need. He took a chair in the public section, set his folder on his knee, and waited. The board members arrived in 2s and 3s over the following several minutes, settling into their chairs, opening laptops, making the small territorial arrangements of people who had been meeting in the same room for a long time. Charlotte Cole came in at 8:28, a woman in her mid-40s with efficient posture and the particular kind of composed, professional manner that Sebastian associated with people who were accustomed to being the most powerful person in any given room. She set down her bag without looking at the visitor chairs. Then she looked. Their eyes met for a moment across the table. Charlotte's expression shifted fractionally, briefly before settling back into its professional neutrality. Sebastian nodded once and looked at his folder. The board chair called the meeting to order. They moved through the first two items on the agenda: a facilities budget update, a revised attendance policy with the efficient rhythm of a group that had done this many times, and then Charlotte Cole, who sat third from the left and had not looked at the visitor chairs again, turned to the board chair and said, "Before we continue, I'd like to note that we have a visitor who was not on today's schedule. Mr. Reed, I believe you have an appointment system you should have used." Sebastian did not stand up. He said, in an even voice, "I don't need an appointment. I need 5 minutes and access to the projector." "That's not how this works," Charlotte said. "No," Sebastian agreed. "What you did to my daughter isn't how it's supposed to work either." A silence settled over the room. Two of the other board members exchanged a look. The board chair, an older man named Thomas Whitfield, who had been in the position for 12 years and had the exhausted steadiness of someone who had survived multiple institutional crises, looked at Sebastian with what appeared to be cautious assessment. "Mr. Reed," he said, "what exactly are you bringing to this board today?" Sebastian stood up. He walked to the front of the room, plugged the USB drive into the projector port, and waited while the screen flickered to life. 19 minutes, he said. "That's all I need." Nobody asked him to sit down. The first slide was a timeline, clean, numbered, with every event in the sequence laid out in the order it had occurred from the date of the quiz, through the filing of the original inconclusive report, through the modification of that report, through the generation and transmission of the expulsion email. No commentary, no accusation, just the record. The second slide showed the metadata comparison, the original misconduct report in its unedited form, and the current version set side by side. The single sentence that had been deleted, the single sentence that had replaced it, and the server log entry below, showing the account that had accessed the file at the modification timestamp. Charlotte Cole's name was on that slide 3 times. Sebastian had not done this for rhetorical effect. He had done it because it was accurate. The room was very quiet. He moved through the evidence the way he had moved through every audit he had ever conducted methodically, without editorial, letting the documents carry the weight. The backup camera footage was on slide 7. He played it without narration. It ran for 53 seconds. Nobody spoke during those 53 seconds, and nobody spoke for several seconds after the clip ended. Slide 9 was the archive data. The 3 previous students, the timeline of each removal, the cross-reference with board member family conflicts. He watched the board members' faces as they read through it, and saw, in several of them, the specific expression of someone who is processing information they had not previously possessed and are not sure. Yet, what to do with it? Slide 14 was the internal message chain. He had printed it full size, and he advanced to it slowly. The conversation was brief, 9 messages over the course of a morning. He let them read to the end. "Handle it quietly. Done." Charlotte Cole said, "That communication is being taken out of context." Sebastian looked at her for a long moment. "The server log shows it was sent from your registered district account at 9:14 on the morning of the expulsion. The expulsion email was generated from the Student Affairs server at 2:03 that afternoon. The context is the log. You don't have authorization to access those records." "I have authorization that was never revoked," Sebastian said, "because the person responsible for revoking it forgot that I existed." Which is a fairly significant oversight in a data security protocol. He paused. "I built that security protocol. I designed the logging architecture for this district in 2017. I know where everything is stored. I know how to read it, and I know that it cannot be altered retroactively without generating a new log entry." The silence in conference room B was absolute. A board member named Robert Haynes, who sat at the far end of the table and had not spoken during the entire presentation, set down his pen and looked at Thomas Whitfield. "Tom," he said quietly, "this has legal implications that we need to take very seriously." Thomas Whitfield looked at Charlotte Cole. Charlotte Cole was looking at the screen, where slide 14 was still displayed. Her expression had changed. The composed professional surface was still there, but something underneath it had shifted irreversibly, and everyone in the room could see it. "I want it noted," Charlotte said, "that this process has not followed proper—" Charlotte. Thomas Whitfield's voice was not loud, but it had a weight to it that cut cleanly through the room. He let the silence hold for a moment. "I think you should stop talking." Charlotte stopped talking. She held herself together well. In the immediate sense, the posture remained intact. The voice stayed level when she did speak again. The professional surface did not crack in any visible way, but the architecture beneath it was gone. Sebastian had watched enough people in enough difficult rooms to recognize the moment when someone understood, fully and finally, that they had been seen not partially, not interpretably, but completely. Every action traced, every decision recorded, every assumption about invisibility dismantled. She tried, once, to shift the frame. She said the system had functioned the way it was designed to function, that her involvement had been administrative rather than directive, that the decisions about Scarlett had been made through proper channels, and that any suggestion of personal motivation was speculative. Sebastian said, "The backup of the original misconduct report is on a district server that hasn't been accessed in 3 days." Mrs. Vance wrote, "Inconclusive. That word was removed from the document using your account credentials. That is not speculative. That is a server log." Charlotte looked at him with an expression that was, for just a moment, unguarded. Something between fury and the particular cold recognition of someone who had underestimated a situation they thought they had controlled. Thomas Whitfield asked 2 of the board members to step into the hallway with him. When they came back 8 minutes later, he said that the board would be convening an emergency closed session to review the materials Sebastian had provided. He asked Sebastian to leave a copy of the file with the administrative assistant. He also said, quietly and directly, that the expulsion of Scarlett Hayes would be reviewed and suspended pending that session. Robert Haynes looked across the table and said, with a precision that left no room for interpretation, "Charlotte, we need to discuss your participation in this matter. You should not be present for the closed session." Charlotte Cole gathered her bag from the back of her chair and left the room. She did not look at Sebastian as she passed him. He did not watch her go. The story moved faster than Sebastian had expected once it moved at all. By the end of the week, the district had issued a formal written reversal of Scarlett's expulsion, citing procedural irregularities. The language was careful and institutional, but it was unambiguous. Charlotte Cole had been placed on administrative leave from the board, pending an independent review. 2 of the 3 families whose children had been removed years earlier had been contacted by district council. Mrs. Vance, it turned out, had kept her own records. When someone from the district's legal office called to discuss her account of events, she produced a handwritten note she had made on the day the misconduct report was altered, a single page, dated and signed, describing a call she had received from Charlotte Cole's assistant, asking her to update her notes to reflect what the committee had determined. She had written it down because she had not known what else to do, and she had kept it because she was, at heart, the kind of teacher who documented things. She had simply been waiting for a moment when it felt safe to show it to someone. Other parents began to come forward. Not many at first, 3, then 5, then more than a dozen, people who had seen or experienced things they had filed away as institutional friction and never pursued. A local journalist started asking questions. The district superintendent, who had apparently been kept in the dark about significant portions of what had been happening under Charlotte Cole's committee, issued a statement that was heavy with the vocabulary of accountability. Sebastian gave no interviews. When the journalist called, he said he had nothing to add to what the records already showed. When the superintendent's office asked if he would participate in a community forum on district governance, he said he would think about it. He did not think about it for long. He had what he had wanted, which was not attention or acknowledgement, but a specific and concrete result. His daughter reinstated, the record corrected, the mechanism exposed. Scarlett went back to Maplewood on a Thursday morning, 2.5 weeks after the night the email arrived. Sebastian drove her. She was quiet in the car, the rabbit tucked into her backpack as always, watching the houses go by outside the window with the particular thoughtfulness of a 7-year-old processing something she doesn't quite have the words for yet. He walked her to the classroom door and crouched down to her level before she went in. He didn't say anything significant. He just straightened the collar of her jacket and told her to have a good day. The classroom was different in ways that were small, but not invisible. The other children looked at her with a kind of attention they hadn't paid before, not unkind, not hostile, just aware. Several of them said hi. A girl named Priya, who sat 2 seats over, asked if she wanted to sit together at lunch. Scarlett said okay, and meant it. Madison Cole was quieter than usual that morning. During the reading period, she passed a folded piece of paper to Scarlett across the aisle between their desks. Scarlett unfolded it in her lap and read it without expression. The note said, in the oversized handwriting of a second grader who was choosing each word carefully, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that." Scarlett folded the note back up and put it in her desk. She did not respond during class. In the hallway, after second period, she passed Madison near the water fountain, and they looked at each other for a moment. Scarlett gave one small nod. Not warm, not cold, but honest. Madison looked at the floor. Scarlett moved on. She told her father about it that evening, over dinner. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked if she felt okay about it. She thought about it the way she thought about most things seriously, without rushing. "I think so," she said. "It doesn't really fix it, but it's something." Sebastian said that was a pretty mature way to look at it. Scarlett shrugged. "Mrs. Vance says the right thing and the easy thing are usually different." Sebastian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Vance is right." On a Saturday afternoon in early October, they were sitting on a bench in the park near their neighborhood, Scarlett feeding pieces of a broken granola bar to a very persistent pigeon, Sebastian reading a document on his phone. The light was the particular gold and gray of a late-season afternoon, and the park was quiet, except for the pigeon and a distant group of kids somewhere on the far side of the trees. Scarlett was quiet for a while. Then she looked at him sideways and asked, "Are you still mad at them?" Sebastian thought about it. Not performatively, not for her benefit, he actually thought about it. The way he thought about all questions that deserved a real answer. He had spent 2 weeks moving through something that might have been anger if he had let it breathe. He had felt, in the early hours of that first night, something very hot and very precise that he had immediately folded back into focus, into purpose, into the next step. He wasn't sure that what he felt now was anger. It was more like a completed circuit, the satisfaction of a system brought back into alignment. "No," he said. "I just didn't want them to do it again." Scarlett considered this, and threw another piece of granola bar at the pigeon, which accepted it without gratitude. "Do you think they will?" "Less likely now," Sebastian said. Scarlett nodded, apparently satisfied. She leaned slightly against her father's arm, and he let her. And they sat there in the pale October light for a while longer without talking. It was 3 days after that when Sebastian received a call from an unfamiliar number. He almost didn't pick up. When he did, the voice on the other end was measured and professional, and introduced itself as Eleanor Grant, newly appointed to the school board following the events of the previous month. She said she was calling because she had read through the documentation he had provided, and she had a question that was perhaps a little unusual. She wanted to know, she said, if he had ever considered consulting work in education data governance. Not auditing, not investigation governance, reform of the systems themselves, so that what had happened to his daughter, and to those other families, could not happen again in the same way. Sebastian said he hadn't considered it recently. Eleanor Grant said she thought it might be worth considering. She had read the methodology he had used to trace the log files. It was, she said, the clearest documentation of a systemic failure she had encountered in 12 years of working in education administration. She paused, and then added, with the directness of someone who did not waste words, that she thought the system needed people who knew where the gaps were. Sebastian stood at the kitchen counter, looking out the window at the backyard, where Scarlett was drawing something in chalk on the patio. He watched her for a moment, the focused way she moved the chalk, the small frown of concentration on her face. "I'll think about it," he said. Eleanor Grant said that was all she was asking. There was a brief silence on the line, not uncomfortable, but present in a way that both of them seemed to acknowledge before it passed. Sebastian said he would be in touch. Eleanor Grant thanked him and ended the call. He put his phone in his pocket and went to the back door and told Scarlett dinner would be ready in 20 minutes. She looked up from her chalk, drawing an ambitious attempt at something that might have been a horse or a very large dog, and told him she needed at least 30. He said 15, and they settled on 25. He went inside and started dinner. The October light came through the kitchen window in long, thin slats. The house was quiet and ordinary, and exactly the size of the life they had built inside it, and Sebastian Reed stood at the counter and chopped vegetables and did not think about Charlotte Cole, or the board meeting, or the expulsion email, or any of it. He thought about Eleanor Grant's voice, which had been careful and direct in the way that he found, without quite intending to, that he appreciated. He thought about the question she had asked. He thought about the 3 families in the archive records who had simply moved their children elsewhere because no one had given them a reason to believe that the system could be corrected. He turned on the stove. Outside, the chalk horse watched the backyard with enormous, optimistic eyes.